parish of Teynham, in the heart of the Kent countryside between Sittingbourne and Faversham, the land has always been given over to fruit and hops. Cherry orchards and hop gardens stretched across the fields, and by the late 19th century the village was a quiet, industrious place, its life tied to the land and the brewing trade. It was the kind of village where everyone knew everyone, and where little of note ever happened. Until the summer of 1887. On the edge of the parish stood Dearton Street Farm, a working farm that grew both cherries and hops. In 1887, the farmhouse was home to George Poysden, a bailiff who managed the land for a local landowner named William Roger Dixon. It was a position of steady work and quiet respect. George lived there with his wife and their daughter, Florence Kate Poysden. Florence was 15 years old, born in 1872. By every account, she was a lively, affectionate girl, well loved at home and well thought of across the village, a devoted pupil at the Teynham Church Sunday School who rarely missed a week. 3 years earlier, in 1884, the Poysdens had taken in a lodger. His name was Charles Walter, a young agricultural laborer, 21 years old when he arrived. At first, he seemed everything a lodger should be, respectable, hard-working, and quiet, and for a time he settled easily into the household and was treated almost as one of the family. But as the months passed, something in Charles Walter began to change. By 1887, it had become clear that he'd formed an unhealthy fixation on the Poysdens' daughter, who had only just turned 15. Florence gave him no encouragement whatsoever. She didn't return his feelings, and she didn't want his attention. Her parents grew increasingly uneasy and did what they could to keep him at arm's length and discourage any familiarity. But the more they tried, the more his fixation seemed to deepen. What might once have been dismissed as a passing fancy had curdled into something darker, and there was one more thing, a small detail that would only take on its full meaning later. The day before it happened, Charles Walter took his razor to be sharpened. On the morning of Wednesday, the 8th of June, 1887, Walter stayed in bed, complaining of an illness he'd been grumbling about for several days. At around 7 o'clock, he called out for Florence and asked her to bring him his medicine. At first, she refused. She didn't want to go into his room alone, but he kept calling, and at last, reluctantly, she carried the medicine upstairs. As she stepped towards the bed and held out the medicine, Charles Walter drew out the razor he'd hidden beneath the bedclothes, and in spite of the girl's struggles, he cut her throat. Bleeding terribly, Florence threw open the bedroom window. In the yard below, she could see her mother, and she cried out to her. Then, somehow finding the strength, she staggered from the room and down the narrow staircase, leaving a trail of blood on every step, until she reached her mother at the bottom. Her father came running too, and when he saw the wound, he took hold of her and cried out, "My poor child, you will die," before rushing off in desperation to fetch the doctor. He wouldn't reach him in time. Florence died in her mother's arms about a quarter of an hour later. Upstairs, having watched from the window as his victim was carried across the yard, Charles Walter turned the razor on himself. But the wound was shallow, and it didn't kill him. When Police Constable Gibson arrived, he found a house in chaos. He took control of the scene, restrained Walter, whose wound was by then being tended by a doctor, and once the young man was fit to be moved, escorted him to Faversham Police Station. The inquest opened the very next day before the coroner, Mr. Harris. The details that emerged were harrowing. Florence had died from a single terrible wound to the throat, so deep it had severed her windpipe. Walter was brought to the court in a cab, and the streets were lined with people come to catch sight of him. He was a small, slightly built young man, fresh-faced with light hair, a neatly trimmed mustache, and rather hollow cheeks, dressed in a dark tweed suit. When he caught sight of Florence's mother, he broke down and wept, and it was some minutes before he could compose himself. The jury were taken to see the bedroom where it had happened. The bed, The walls and the floor were still covered in blood. One by one, the witnesses told their story. George Poisden described his daughter carrying the medicine up to the lodger and the scream at the window only minutes later. Florence's mother, her voice trembling, told how she'd met her dying daughter at the foot of the stairs and carried her as far as the granary, and how Florence had managed to gasp out what Walter had done before she slipped away. She told the court something else too. After the killing, Walter had come downstairs in his nightclothes, the wound at his own throat, and with a strange, detached calm had reached out his hand to her and said, "Oh, Mrs. Poisden, forgive me and shake hands. You have always been so good to me. I can't think what I did it for." A little later, dressed now, he'd said it again, and added that he'd be hanged for what he had done. Mrs. Poisden also revealed that the day before the murder, Florence had told Walter plainly that she didn't want him dallying after her, words that had visibly angered him. The picture built, piece by piece. A neighbor who'd arrived as Florence lay dying had asked Walter why he had done it, and he'd answered that she had been teasing him, saying she meant to go out that afternoon. The doctor, Mr. Manning, testified that Walter had told him that when Florence came into his room, the desire had suddenly seized him to kill her. Others spoke of the long, jealous fixation he'd shown towards her, one that flared whenever she was cold to him or spent her time with anyone else. And Constable Gibson recalled that when he arrested him, Walter had said only, "Yes, and I don't know what I did it for." Walter himself declined to question any of the witnesses. When the magistrate asked if he had anything to say, he answered, "I can't remember doing it, sir, and that is the truth." The jury returned their verdict without difficulty. Florence Kate Poisden had died from wounds deliberately inflicted by Charles Walter, and he was committed to stand trial for willful murder. Florence was buried that Saturday afternoon. Around 200 people came, most of them villagers who had known the family. The service was led by the vicar of Teynham, the Reverend Corbould, and the children of the Sunday school followed her coffin in a slow procession. It was adorned with 20 wreaths from the vicar, from the schoolmaster, from the parish children, from the teachers she'd sat among week after week. A whole village grieving for a girl whose kindness they had all known. Charles Walter was taken from Faversham to Maidstone prison to await his trial, and again the crowds gathered to watch him pass, murmuring in disbelief at the savagery of the crime, the youth of the girl, and the betrayal of a household that had taken this man in as one of their own. But the trial everyone was waiting for never truly happened. On Saturday the 9th of July, 1887, Charles Walter was brought before the court at Maidstone. Almost at once a question rose above everything else, whether he was even fit to stand trial at all. The superintendent of the Barming Heath Asylum, Dr. Francis Davies, gave evidence. He'd examined Walter the week before, and in his judgment, the prisoner wasn't in a fit state to understand the charge against him. His grasp of his own situation, the doctor said, was hazy at best, and there was a family history, an uncle confined in that very same asylum, which pointed to a hereditary disorder of the mind. On that evidence, the judge directed the jury to find Charles Walter unfit to plead, and so the case never went to an ordinary trial. There was no verdict of guilt, no reckoning in a crowded courtroom. Instead, the judge ordered that Walter be detained in an asylum during Her Majesty's pleasure, an indefinite confinement with no fixed end and no date of release. And that was how it ended. No trial worthy of the name, no answer that satisfied anyone, and no punishment that felt equal to what had been done. What lingered instead was the memory of a 15-year-old girl killed in her own home by a man her family had welcomed and trusted, and the quiet grave in Teynham churchyard where she lies to this day.